the foreign policy stuff. So the questions that I have with regard to Biden on foreign policy, very, very simple question. Do you think that the situation in the Middle East is better now than it was under Donald Trump?
Probably. That's a hard one. The factors that I'm making right now are obviously you've got the Israel-Palestinian war that's going on right now, which is kind of bad, but like broadly speaking, I'm not sure how much that affects the Middle East as much as like the collapse of Syria. 2013 Syrian Civil War sent millions of immigrants throughout all of Europe.
Which was under
Obama and continued under Trump. Trump didn't do anything to alleviate any of the Syrian Civil War. Why
did Syria end up as a preserve of Russia again?
How did Syria end up as a preserve of Russia?
Yes. Why did it end up being essentially a client state of Russia?
I know that Putin enjoys access to the ports down there. I don't know.
The reason is because Barack Obama suggested that there was a red line that would be drawn in the face of chemical weapons use. Bashar Assad then used chemical weapons in Syria, and Barack Obama was unwilling to then essentially create consequences for Syria in the form of any sort of Western strike. And so instead he outsourced it to Russia. This is 2013, 2014.
Sure. Right? Do you think there might have been some hesitancy after seeing how Libya ended up that maybe us intervening?
Who was president during Libya?
Obama.
Yeah.
Sure, but what does that have to do with anything though? I'm just saying there might have been a mistake learned.
The point that I'm making is that actually the Middle East, just historically speaking, was historically good under Donald Trump. It's very difficult to make the case that either before or after Trump were better than during Donald Trump.
Syrian, I don't think that Trump contributed to the Syrian situation in improving much. I think he
wrecked ISIS. He did wreck ISIS, which was in the...
ISIS had been getting wrecked by the Kurds in Iraq, by every single person, by Assad's army, by Putin, by Turkey. Literally everybody was fighting against ISIS at that point.
There's a spike in violence, and then the Trump... you get credit for when you're president, presumably. Things got better with ISIS under Trump.
Yeah, they did.
Things got worse with ISIS under Obama.
For sure.
He called them the JV squad.
Sure.
And then they became not the JV squad.
Yeah, but I don't know if ISIS is originating in Syria and Baghdadi, and all of the growth of that is necessarily Obama's fault. I know that we like to say that Obama created ISIS. I don't know if you say that, but I've heard that saying a lot. I think that's a little bit simplistic. I don't think that when I'm looking at actions that presidents have taken, the biggest criticism I have for Middle Eastern policy is I think the Doha Accords were a disaster. And I think that's one of the biggest blemishes that we have right now. I would also argue that moving the embassy to Jerusalem was also kind of silly and arguably contributed to some of the conflict we see right now between Israel and Palestine.
I'll argue precisely the opposite, especially given the fact that after the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords continued to sign and actually expand. And that if Donald Trump had been elected, I have no doubt in my mind that Saudi Arabia would now be a part of the Abraham Accords. In fact, that was basically pre-negotiated. And then when Joe Biden took office, Joe Biden took a very anti-Saudi stance on a wide variety of issues. The biggest single effect in the Middle East of Joe Biden's presidency, and again, I agree with you that not every foreign policy issue can be laid at the hands of a president. Joe Biden's main approach to the Middle East was very similar to the Obama approach, which is why the Middle East was chaotic under Obama and chaotic under Biden. And that was to alienate allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and instead to try to make common cause or cut deals with Iran. What that did is incentivize terrorism from Iran. What we're watching in the Middle East is Iran attempting to use every one of its terror proxies in the Middle East, and it was specifically launched in an attempt to avoid what Biden actually was trying to do, which was good, which was, after 2 years of failure with Saudi Arabia, try to bring them into the Abraham Accords, right? That was what was burgeoning at the end of last year. And Iran saw that, and Iran decided that they were going to throw a grenade into the middle of those negotiations by essentially activating Hamas. Hamas commits October 7th. Israel, as a sovereign nation state, has to respond to the murder of 1,200 of its citizens and the taking kidnapping of 240. Israel has to do that not only to go after its own hostages and try to restore them, but also to reestablish military deterrence in the most violent region of the world. Hezbollah gets active on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. They get active on the northern border. The Houthis in Yemen get active. These are all the only reason all this is happening at the same time is because Iran is doing this, right? And not just that, they are threatening global shipping.
Sure.
If you're talking about the effects of global supply lines, which I totally agree had a major inflationary effect on the economy thanks to COVID, right now the cost of shipping is nearly double what it was just a few weeks ago, and that is because a ragtag group of Houthi barbarians are attacking international shipping and forcing everybody to stop using the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, instead going around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. all of that is the result of the fact that Joe Biden reoriented the United States in the very early days in favor of a more pro-Iranian stance. He appointed Robert Malley to negotiate the Iran deal, who, as it turns out, was using proxies. Many of his aides were actually taking money from Iran. The Biden administration, literally one of their first acts was to delist the Houthis as a terror organization and end sanctions against the Houthis. These are all moves that Biden made very early on. They were disastrous moves. But when it comes to domestic policy, I think he hasn't been nearly as damaging on domestic policy as he has been on foreign policy.
Sure. So just on a couple of Middle Eastern things. So one of the big things that threw the Middle East into disaster was, what we are all traumatized by it now, was the Iraq invasion, which happened under a Republican president.
Sure.
You agree with that, right?
Sure.
Yes. The deposition of Saddam Hussein and everything that followed after probably contributed more to the growth of ISIS and the destabilization of that entire region, probably more than anything else. I think that prior to Bush, for Clinton, and even at the beginning of Bush's presidency, we were on some kind of road to normalcy with Iran, which I think has to happen, whether we like them or not, until Bush, for whatever reason, decides to throw Iran into the axis of evil.
And I need some evidence that we were on a road to normalcy with Iran in the 1990s.
We do in the, wait, what?
That we were on a road to normalcy with Iran in the 1990s.
My understanding is that, from the late 90s and prior to the axis of evil labeling of Iran, that there was going to be some path forward to where we could start to normalize relationships with them.
I find that very difficult to believe, and I don't see a lot of evidence. I mean, we can just disagree on that.
Sure, we can disagree on that, but I know that
the after effects, just a quick note, the after effect of the Iraq War that was the most devastating was the increase in power of Iran.
I agree. Yeah, because of the destabilization of Iraq and Iraq not having a government there that was functional for at least a decade,
and was in fact a Sunni government. Right, originally it was a Sunni government. Disbanding the Sunni army was one of the worst things that the Bush administration did.
Banning all the former Ba'ath parties,
sectarian,
all horrible under a Republican president. But
don't disagree.
That that probably contributed more to ISIS, to the growth of power in Iran, maybe even to the destabilization of Syria, probably more than anything that Obama did. Also, when we look at Iran funding people in the region, I don't disagree with that as well. I think Iran is the number one instigator of bad guy things right now in the Middle East. Iran, the IRGC, I supported when Donald Trump killed Soleimani. I think that was a great thing. I think that Iran is a major problem. However, I don't know if the path forward is constantly being a belligerent to Iran or trying to figure out some road to normalcy. I don't know if the collapse of Iran or the destruction of that country, considering how unpopular the Ayatollah even is there, like the citizens of Iran, I don't think are big supporters of the government there. I feel like moving on a path where, let's do our nuclear inspections. We had that Iranian nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. Let's do the nuclear inspections. Make sure you're not on a way to nuclear weapons. Let's unfreeze some funds. Let's move in some direction where we get on a good term with you. I feel like that's the most important thing that needs to happen in the Middle East. As much as people like to look at the Abraham Accords, who cares if, what was it? Bahrain, I think Oman, I think
UAE,
Sudan,
Morocco.
The UAE and Morocco, are something like all of these people, even Saudi Arabia, already have like de facto normalization with Israel anyway. They're all trading.
No, to pretend that anybody even 15 years ago would have been talking about normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel is insane.
They were already on that path. They had already been they were already de facto trading partners with each other. They had already been collaborating and doing things.
That's a wild claim that Israel and Saudi Arabia were going to normalize 15 years ago.
15 years ago might have been a wild claim.
But
after Turkey, after Jordan, and then in the past 20 years of economic relations and ties with each other, all of the leadership in the Middle East, and you'll agree with this, look at Israel and they go, okay, well, we've got Palestinians who, God bless them, do nothing. And then you've got Israel, which is on a region with no natural resources to somehow become like an economic giant. They're good to trade with. Their population is educated. They, have military power. All of the leadership in these Middle Eastern countries are wanting to be friendly with Israel and are engaging in trade de facto with Israel. And the idea that the UAE and Bahrain were brought in to say oh, well, now we're going to officially say this. Those
were the first steps toward obviously the formation of a new Middle East in which economics would predominate over sectarian conflict. The chief obstacle to that is Iran.
I agree.
The notion that negotiations with the Ayatollah were going to be a solution to any of this is,
but do we think
absolutely benighted.
Is it the Abraham Accords that's convincing Saudi Arabia to take a stance against Iran?
No, I mean, Saudi Arabia.
They're already fighting. They're already fighting with each other, right?
No,
I don't think the Abraham Accords moved us any closer towards any type of real peace in the region.
No, the point
what has to happen is something has to happen with Iran. There has to be some diplomatic bilateral communication there.
No, what has to happen is the containment of Iran, which was what was what was taking place with the increased normalization with the Sunni Arab world and Israel, combined with significant economic sanctions. The notion that there's this far-fetched notion in foreign policy circles that diplomacy can sort of be wish cast out of thin air. That if you sit around a table, that you can always come to an agreement with somebody. The Ayatollahs do not have common interests with the United States. They do not. And this idea that they are willing to take money in exchange for example, some sort of peaceful acquiescence to Israel's existence is obviously untrue.
Hasn't that been the case, though? That you've had a region with tons of sectarian violence for a long time, and then finally Turkey was like, you know what? This isn't worth it. The United States paid them a lot of money. They had conversations with Israel. And you know what? The economy, the economic gains.
Well, I mean, the relation.
Same thing with Jordan. Same thing with
not getting into Turkish politics. But
sure,
but the situation with Turkey was actually quite warm between Israel and Turkey in the 90s when you had the sort of secular Muslim regime
in the 90s, but they signed
Kemal Ataturk in place, and now Erdogan has joined in the fray, and Erdogan is significantly more radical than what came before.
So sorry. If I said Turkey, I meant Egypt. My bad.
Yeah. Okay. So
Egypt. Yeah.
Right.
So like, in terms of like Egypt and Jordan, right, were the first two.
You need
big ones.
So here's the thing. Is it possible that you could theoretically come to a deal with Iran only with a new leadership crew? Okay. This is true for every peace agreement in the region. You could not. Israel could not have made peace with.
Well, they made peace with Egypt, and Sadat was the leader for Yom Kippur, right?
He did not make peace with Nasser. Right.
Sure.
The point is that this is a different regime. You need a different regime.
But I'm saying the same regime that did the part of the Yom Kippur War was the same regime that negotiated peace with Israel.
I mean, that's true. It is also true that is a relationship that could be cultivated specifically because it was Sadat who made clear he was going to come to the table. Have the Iranians ever made clear that they would come to the table over, for example, the existence of the state of Israel?
No.
I mean, that is not a thing that's going to happen.
But I think people probably felt the same.
Every single one of their proxy groups, every one of them, not only calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, they also call for the destruction of America. I mean, this is literally the Houthi slogan. They're busy hitting ships, and their slogan is literally Allahu Akbar, death to America, death to the Jews, death to Israel. It doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, and it's not all that catchy, but that is in fact their slogan. The notion that the regime that propagates that is going to be approached with diplomacy is not only wrong. The problem is that it's easy to say that the stakes of diplomacy are okay. Well, so we try to talk, right? Jaw is better than war. Sure. The only problem is that in the Middle East, weakness is taken as a sign that aggression might be an appropriate response. That is how things work in the Middle East. And the fact that that Joe Biden came into office with an orientation toward continuing the Obama policies in Iran has led to conflagrations, these sort of brush fires breaking out everywhere that Iran has borders with either the West or Israel or both, right? Any place that's happening is leading to brush fires because, again, the logic of violence in the Middle East is not quite the logic of violence in other places in the world. By the way, I think the logic of violence in the Middle East is actually closer to what most international politics looks like than we wish that it were. I mean, I think that's part of what's happening in Ukraine as well.
So you think
which brings me, by the way, here's my question about Ukraine.
Sure. Well, just real quick, and then you can answer this one now. So you think that for Iran, right, a country that has been sanctioned for God knows how many years now, you think that for Iran, just continuing to sanction them and contain them is more effective than trying to engage them in bilateral or multilateral peace talks?
Yes, 100%. Okay. And the proof is in the pudding.